Today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. I am starting a series documenting the efforts of activists of different perspectives coming from all kinds of ideological and political persuasions. And this is to provide a more integral perspective on the broader social landscape, given the fact that the current political environment is quite partisan and divided. So without further ado, let's get started. Today we are going to be discussing what is going on in Ukraine with Victoria of the Ukrainian Student Association at UConn. So we met at a protest last week to raise awareness for what is going on in Ukraine. How do you feel the protest you guys created went, and how did that come about?
Yeah, I think it went really well. I think our main goal was just to bring people together. And I was quite surprised to see how much overwhelming support that we got. And I think that's just really great for us during this time. I just felt that a lot of our members were very distressed about the situation and also wanted to enact some sort of action to give some light and to kind of look on the bright side of things. What came about, how that came about was we wanted to just bring awareness of the situation to the UConn community and kind of call attention for UConn to support Slavic students, and also just to bring awareness of what Ukraine is calling for things such as protecting the airspace, for NATO allies, for being able to get defensive weaponry and also equipment and medical supplies to Ukraine, and just overall bring awareness to that. And so we all felt that this would be a good push for that. And we were also taking example with other communities that were also holding protests all over the world.
Perfect. Yeah, it was a pretty good turnout, and it was a good opportunity to learn about some of the Ukrainian heritage as well. So I was wondering if you could give us an overview, who are non-Ukrainian, of the situation that is happening there.
Yeah, so most recently, in the early morning of Friday, February 25th, around kind of 11 p.m. Thursday of our time, Russian forces invaded Ukraine, and their intent was to secure the independence of the regions Donetsk and Luhansk. And so since then, there have been shellings, bombings, missile strikes all across Ukraine, and there is just a lot of damage to military and also civilian infrastructure. I think the estimates now are around like 15,000 dead, and this includes troops and also civilians, and over 1.5 million residents displaced and seeking refuge. And so the reason that these regions of Donetsk and Luhansk were sought after was because they are separatist regions of Ukraine that are recognized by Russia as independent nations.
Another thing that I wondered is if there's currently the situation we see between Russia and Ukraine. I was wondering if if this tension has a little bit of additional history as well.
Oh yeah, there is definitely a ton of history, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. I know, both countries have very similar roots. They both started from the Kievan Rus, which was like a medieval kingdom, founded back in 800s. And so, we have very similar roots, and Ukraine was under the Soviet Union, and so a lot of Ukrainians didn't want to join that Soviet empire, and so they tried to form their own country. But the Soviets defeated that movement and kind of created a socialist republic there. And so at first they allowed Ukrainians to keep that culture. But then once they were more asking for more independence and had more power, they decided that they wouldn't uphold that culture. I feel like the Russian government has always seen themselves as like the big brother of these two nations, and always wanted that upper hand, even though we did both, stem from the same beginning, but kind of diverged in the type of future and cultures that we were hoping to uphold. So then in 1991, the Soviet Union did collapse. And so that's when Ukraine was able to claim its own independence. But I think that where the tensions start kind of with this more modern relationship is the Orange Revolution. So this took place after the Ukrainian presidential elections in 2004. And a lot of people claim that there was massive corruption, a lot of protests between the two candidates, Yushchenko and then Yanukovych, which kind of had opposing beliefs, whether they wanted to be more pro-Russia or pro-European. But this resolved, after all the protest, there was a victory, and this did resolve in Yushchenko becoming president from 2005 to 2010, who was more pro-European relations. However, in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, who was considered more pro-Russian, was declared the winner of that election, and so, which was fine with the people until he decides to turn away from Europe, and so from the pressure from the Russian government, Yanukovych decided to decline a union agreement with the EU, and so this really upset the Ukrainian people and resulted in protests, which are called Maidan protests, for him to resign. And so this was, I think, over 90 people died because of the intensification of violence that resulted with the clashing of the Ukrainians and then the enforcements, which were Russian-backed. And then in kind of later after this, because I think this resolved in like February 2014, then in March 2014, Russian troops entered Crimea and annexed it. And so since then, there's kind of been, I feel, a war that has cost 14,000 lives with, just the conflict that was going on in those eastern regions. And so, but then there was this full-fledged invasion that happened most recently. And so, yeah, I hope that kind of puts in perspective that this was a very long history. And so this is nothing really new, but it's at a point where it just needs to conclude.
That's very well put. There's a lot of context. And so my next question is about the leadership of Russia and the West, because, I mean, in the past century with the Cold War, there's been some tension there. And this might come across as a little bit naive, but if the leaders of both Russia and the West wanted to work towards peace, how could this be achieved? What would this require on both sides?
Yeah, I think that's quite a hard question to answer. I think it's just both parties are so, committed to their propositions. And so I think it would be really hard to compromise, but I think that's the only way that sort of peace could be achieved. I think that everyone, though, agrees that Russian government invasion was just a step too far. And so that fighting would have to end. And because this is targeting a lot of civilians, and that I think is just not okay whatsoever. But I know that Russia just wants to avoid Ukraine from joining NATO and also having stronger relations with Europe, because he sees that as a threat, the Russian government sees that as a threat. So I think it would just have to be some sort of compromise, some sort of balance where the relations of Ukraine with Russia, but then also the West, with Europe, with the US, would be in some sort of balance that would benefit both parties, and that, but then be able to have that balance. And I think it's hard in a way too, because I think Ukraine needs to be in the, Ukraine would be in the middle of that, but I think that that's the key aspect there, is that Ukraine is its own sovereign nation, and should be able to make those decisions with those, with the leaders of both Russia and the West.
How do you feel about Ukraine being in the middle of some of the conflict between the U.S. and Russia? Because I've noticed in my own studying of history, the U.S. has intervened in South America and the Middle East, and the outcomes of that are not always pleasant, to say the least. So, I mean, how do you feel about the Ukraine being caught between the U.S. and Russia?
Yeah, I think just generally, I think it's just unfortunate, because I think from what I've known, politically and also geographically, Ukraine is just such a perfect like liaison and intermediate there. And so I think it's just unfortunate that it has to always result in these conflicts, instead of being just left in peace and left as its own sovereign nation, which is all kind of the people are asking for and want.
That's a very good point, because on social media, I do see people in Berlin, in the U.S., in New York, but also in Russia protesting this. So people of all nationalities and points of view. But unfortunately, with conflict, dehumanization happens. There was, I think I saw an article about, there was a Russian restaurant in D.C. that was vandalized. So how do we, on the one hand, acknowledge the human rights and dignity of the Ukrainian people while recognizing the humanity of the Russians who don't want any part of this war any more than we do?
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I didn't even hear that story. And I think that's quite unfortunate. I think, as you've seen, me trying to implement this sort of language throughout this interview is just referring to the actions, the war, trying to refer to kind of our opponent as the Russian government or the Kremlin or Putin, and kind of really emphasizing that this is the government that's in charge of this and not actually the Russian civilians. I really think of them as, our Slavic sisters and brothers, because they are not working against us. And I think you can realize that with the amount of protests that the Russian citizens are having. And I've just seen so many videos, and, they didn't ask for this. They don't want to reap the consequences of the sanctions on Russia. And so, yeah, I think that it's just keeping those things in mind, making sure that that language is correct and courteous, to be able to support those citizens, and also those that have Russian heritage, because it shouldn't be something that they should be ashamed of. This is just an unfortunate consequence of their government's actions.
Very well put. So what should the role of the United States be in this conflict, which, as I understand, is tough from kind of a progressive anti-war stance?
Yeah, I think that definitely we're not really asking involvement of U.S. military, and I think that it is hard, as you said, with that anti-war stance. But there's no denying that a war has resulted, and so I think the best way to proceed with that is just to help the defenses of Ukraine and help support Ukraine, and that can be with imposing sanctions, providing medical supplies, providing equipment, just any resources that are in need, also providing those resources to neighbor countries that are homing a lot of refugees. Because I think something that I've learned or something that I know is that Ukrainians are willing to defend their country and willing to fight. I read somewhere that up to 80,000 people returned home to Ukraine from abroad to fight in the war. So they are very prideful and very passionate, and so they will defend their country by any means necessary. They just need the resources to do so. And I think that it's definitely the United States needs to take that stance of supporting Ukraine. Just I know even they're tied by treaty. I know a lot of history is going around about the Budapest memorandum, where Ukraine agreed to transfer its nuclear weapons to Russia and be nuclear free in return to U.S. and also United Kingdom assistance. And so I think that really should come to play now.
What is currently happening in the Ukraine that you would like to bring awareness to that is not being spoken of in the mainstream media or social media?
I think that we observe a lot of unfortunate, tragedies through a social media perspective or mainstream media perspective. And I think it's hard to take that very personally. But speaking from, my personal experience and my experience with most of my family being in Ukraine, I think that I just want to convey how much this is disrupting lives. And I know, for my family, most of them are not going to work anymore. All my cousins are not attending school anymore. They've had to flee their homes and not knowing if they're going to be able to return, and had to flee to neighboring countries like Poland. But even some of my family don't have that ability to do so, and so they are just kind of stuck in the middle. And I think that everyone's just so scared for their future and their lives. But also at the same time, this is nothing new for the Ukrainian people. Like I said, there's been a long history of these tensions. I know stories from my great grandmother about World War II and how much tragedy that caused. But this is something that needs to stop now because people were living their lives in peace. And this kind of came out of nowhere and just really has disrupted disrupted the whole balance of things. I know I've seen a lot of social media accounts. I think that's pretty cool to see that people can get an accurate reflection of how people are personally affected. I've seen accounts where it's people posting, Ukrainian citizens who are posting about their families and trips they went on, and then it just completely turned sour where now they're posting about their apartments being blown up and their children being injured and things like that. So I think it's important just to convey how tragic this is. And also that action needs to be taken for this so that more destruction doesn't occur, and that this is pretty time sensitive.
So historically, we see that when things like this happen, it can build tension and escalate things further. Do you see there being some kind of de-escalation, or do you see the tension increasing?
I think that honestly it could go either way, and it just depends on the actions that we take now, but also kind of the willingness, the willingness of the Russian government and how far they're willing to go. I don't know if the comment's true, but I did hear some sort of comment that Putin his goal was to kind of gain power of the whole country. So I think with that, it would be that would cause a lot more disruption if they were not willing to compromise. But I think that there's always hope if there's action being taken, if those sanctions are increasing, if the Russian economy collapses, there's no way that they can fund a war or be able to conquer on like this. So I think that it can go either way, but it really depends on the actions that we do now.
What would the best way to implement the sanctions be? Because on the one hand, imperialism is not cool, no matter who's doing it, the U.S., Russia, or otherwise. But then on the other, if sanctions are imposed, that can have negative effects on the civilians. So what would be a strategic implementation of sanctions where it's clear to Putin that the invasion is not, and killing of civilians is not tolerated, but at the same time not hurting the Russian civilians?
Yeah, I think that's like a good point, and kind of what we touched on before is that the Russian civilians are hurting just because of all the sanctions that are being put on, like even things as kind of arbitrary as, access to streaming services. I think that somewhere I saw that, sanctions against like Russian government leaders personally should be inflicted. Freezing their assets of any Russian oligarchs, so that they aren't able to kind of be detached from the population, be able to kind of live their lives freely and not care about their civilians. Also, just ending any money laundering in the West, just being able to not support any collaboration there if they don't stop these violent attacks. Just because I think these severe sanctions need to be enacted now and go into effect, just so that further invasion isn't possible, and also that more civilian lives aren't lost. Because I think the more it prolongs, the worse it will get.
It's kind of like a classic progressive take on war, is that it's always the ultra wealthy who don't have to fight them or really experience these things that are so eager to use the younger people who have to fight. So speaking of, I guess, a fight, but in a bit of a different context, how can people support Ukraine? How do they know what causes are legit and where the support goes towards?
Yeah, I also just want to point out too, like overall, I'm no expert in these matters and no expert in like the history nor the political kind of relations, but I guess this is just kind of my perspective and just what I hope for, or what the outcomes are. So yeah, but I think that is a lot of power in people that that live outside Ukraine. I think you're mostly referring to ways to support including donations, and how like people can know if they're real. I know unfortunately in any matters, like people will take advantage of situations like this for their own gain. I know some tips I found that always using credit cards when doing donations, because those things can always be canceled if something gets exposed. There's also a lot of verification sites such as Charity Navigator, in which you can kind of see reviews of certain charity organizations. There's also well-known organizations like the Red Cross or UNICEF, or Ukrainian-based organizations like Razom, which continuously have updates on their website, on their social media, so you can actually see them buying the medical supplies and getting them out to people. So I think those are good ways just to see that your money is going to somewhere that is real and certified. So yeah, I think those are just some ways that are that you can be able to know that your money's going in the right place. Besides that, though, I know there's some petitions, some other ways that people can support. Is there some petitions for NATO support, for no-fly zone that are easy to find on the web that people can sign. Also, just writing to local representatives, to pressuring them to support Ukraine in any way they can. And then besides that, just keeping informed and also being able to, piece out misinformation and not share that. And then something I guess I'd recommend is watching the Netflix documentary Winter on Fire. And in this way, people can learn more about kind of the tensions that came up to this point. And this would go over the Maidan kind of revolution that I referred to previously. I think that just kind of in a more entertainment way outlines kind of the whole history that I was mentioning before, so that people can really understand, how long this has been going on and how unjust it is. And yeah, and just showing up for people, showing up to protests. There's a website called stopputin.net, which lists a bunch of protests that are happening in the US. And then just checking in on your Slavic friends and being able to support people personally as well helps a ton, because it's been quite rough for us.
You actually inadvertently finished all my last questions, which is pretty cool. About how people can get involved. Especially writing to representatives, I think, is a good thing on any number of issues. Can be a really good way to put a little bit of pressure on those in power, particularly during election years. So is there anything that concludes all of the questions that I have on this subject matter? Is there anything else you would like the listeners to know?
Yeah, I think if it's okay with you, if I'm able to, I'm not sure your audience, but if anyone is from the University of Connecticut, you can follow our Instagram at USA_UConn, or our partner at Slavic UConn for updates on that student population. But for more overall updates, and these are all Instagram accounts. There's an Instagram account at Ukraine.ua, which posts a lot of photography from the kind of scenes of action, but also just updates on this war. So I think that the best way people can help is just to stay informed.
That concludes our very first episode of The Art of Activism. Thank you, Victoria, for being with us, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors.
Yeah, thank you for having me and spreading awareness on this. It's really appreciated. Really appreciated. Really appreciated. Really appreciated.